o'clock. But right now we have Bernie Power, speaker and author and researcher and all sorts of other wonderful, wonderful titles I could give Bernie. Essentially, he's an expert on Islam and Christianity, and he's here today to share with us his knowledge and just how important it is for us to understand key words and phrases regarding Islam. Bernie, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Cheryl. Greetings to your listeners.
Bernie, I've known you for a few years now, and I've tried very hard to get you to speak at a number of engagements, and there's always been this particular fear that it's going to raise issues or people would feel uncomfortable regarding conversations around Islam. It couldn't be more important, and I would object strongly, as I have, to anybody who thinks that it's not an important topic. How do you manage to get your message out? And when I say your message, the knowledge you have about Islam.
I think the important thing is to take into account all of the information that's out there and not kind of dodge it, but rather speak about the things that we know, things that have been around for quite a long time, 1400 years, and put those out. And I do that by speaking on TV, radio, writing articles, books, public meetings, anyway I can get out there to talk about it.
Well done, that's great. So what led you to specialising in Islam and Christianity?
Yeah, so as a young person, I was kind of trying to think about what I'd like to do with my life and where I would go in terms of that. And I actually became a Christian at Sydney University when I was doing a science degree there, and then went into teaching. And in the process of that, came across the issues of Islam and the impact that Islam was starting to have back. So this would be in the 1980s, thinking about what impact it was going to have. And then as political things unfolded, and I found that Islam was having much more of an impact on the world than people recognised. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda made us understand that it was more than just a religion. Islam was actually a total ideology which involved political, social, economic, and military aspects, as well as the religious and spiritual ones.
So is that what you're saying then, Bernie, is that Islam is, to suggest that Islam is a religion doesn't cover it in its entirety? So could you explain what Islam is?
Yeah, so we need to go right back to the life of Muhammad and understand how he thought about Islam. So when he started in Mecca, so he was born in 570 AD, at 40 years old he received a call to be a prophet and went out onto the streets of Mecca and started preaching. And for 12 years he was basically a religious preacher. He tried to get people to turn to Allah, the God of Islam, and turn away from the idols that the Arabs were worshipping, and to live righteous lives. So that was basically his call then. But it wasn't a very popular message, and the people rejected it and they persecuted him. And he had no way of changing that because he had no political or military power. But then in 622 he moved to another city, Medina, which I was in actually earlier this year, in Saudi Arabia, and there he got political and military support from the people of the city, and then he started preaching a different message, that Islam was something that should impact every part of a person's life, their economic life, their political life, and he became a military and a political and a social leader, as well as a religious leader. So for him it was a complete package. You had to accept the whole lot of it, and when he called people to accept Islam, they needed to accept him as as Allah's representative on earth. They need to obey him completely. He got involved in military campaigns to attack the caravans that were travelling around Arabia at that time, attacking villages. And so the military aspect also became very important. And so I would understand Islam as a total a total ideology of life that impacts every aspect of a person's being. The way that the women dress, the way that the men wear their beards, all of these things are dictated from the time of Muhammad.
So, is it fair to say it's a philosophy as opposed to an ideology? The reason why I'm asking this question is that ideology is almost the flavour of the month, and particularly when we're talking about culture wars and so forth. So, I suppose, what is the distinction between an ideology and a philosophy?
Yeah, so philosophy would be something that a person can carry out within their own thinking, so you may pick up a philosophy like, say, existentialism, and that will impact the way that you think about life, the way that you approach it, and what you do in your personal life and maybe in your public life. But an ideology has got a bigger plan. And, the other ones that are around would be, say, Marxism is an ideology that's around at the moment, National Socialism, so you've got one from the left and one from the right, and they would say, look, we have an end goal. This is the kind of society that we want to see. This is how it should operate. These are the people who should be in power. These are the values that are important. And Islam fits fairly and squarely in that camp, because it's not just you have some religious rituals that you can carry out in your privacy of your home or go to the mosque and do them, but rather it, and right from the very beginning, has been a way in which all of life and all of society is structured. So the ultimate goal of Islam would be the establishment of an Islamic state ruled by Sharia law, and it would dictate the kind of foods that people eat, the way that they operate their social relationships, for example, the separation of men and women, women wearing the hijab, the political system, so democracy is not permitted under an Islamic rule. And the models that we have today would be, say, the Taliban in Afghanistan and in Iran, where they have the Shia Islamic State. Saudi Arabia tried, but they're actually moving away from the model, and Mohammed bin Salman is introducing a whole lot of Western kind of concepts into their society, and not receiving the support from the mullahs, the Islamic leaders, because of that, because they believe that he's not implementing all of the elements of Islam that he should be implementing. So I would call it an ideology because it really is, in a sense, totalitarian, and particularly it's got this goal that involves all of society. You can't actually opt out of it. You have to, even if you don't believe in it, you have to obey it. And so there's a place there, for example, this wouldn't require every person to convert to Islam, but they have a category called the Zimmi, where there would be people of some religions, Christianity and Islam would be among them, where they would be seen, they call it protected classes, but they're actually classes which have got fewer rights within the society. So there is a place there, but it needs to be under the umbrella of Sharia law that's dictated to by the those in political power.
Bernie, you've explained that extremely well. So what we're saying, it's totalitarianism essentially. Sharia law is the goal, and the goal is that Sharia law will be right across the world, and therefore a controlling influence on all, whether or not you are Muslim.
Exactly.
Okay, so then from that context, when we hear phrases like political Islam, Islamic terrorists, and so radical Islam is another one, we're using these adjectives to essentially confuse or water down, not saying it's deliberate, but it is confusing and watering down exactly what it is that you have explained, this ideology that is all-controlling and all-consuming of people and their rights.
Yes, and the other thing is that the Muslim community is not united in terms of how this goal should be implemented. And so you'll find, I teach on Islamic studies, and I say you always need to think of the Muslim community as a spectrum. And so you'll have some who are very liberal Muslims who will say, look, Islam is, a philosophy, a great way to live, but it's for me personally, or maybe they don't even practice it, but they would say that it's a way of thinking about the world. In the middle, there would be the traditionalists who would say, yes, look, for us, it's the thing that would determine our daily lives. So if we pray 5 times a day, we read the Quran, we give zakat or charity, we try to obey the laws as best we can. But at the pointy end, it is the radical and extremist one, which would say we need to implement Islam by the use of political and military power. And amongst them, some would say the only way to go is through terrorism activities, suicide bombings. And others would say, no, you can't do that. We need to be a little bit more nuanced, and we need to aim for political power. And so the idea of civilizational change is an important one. So they would seek to gain positions of importance and seek to influence the public debate, and also the ways in which resources are distributed and the way that the society operates. So even amongst Muslims, there's not agreement on how this should be done, but ultimately they would say the best society would be a society which lives under Sharia, which is basically a theocracy, without democracy, and that the social relationships, political, economic, legal relationships would all be dictated to by Islam.
Now, President Erdogan from Turkey makes that very, very clear. And he has, as early as last year, spoke at an event discussing Islam and warned against anyone who dared to criticise Islam. And he made it very, very clear that Sharia represents the entirety of Islam's rules on life. And that is a very powerful phrase. Sharia represents the entirety of Islam's rules on life. I think that just about captures it for all of us, doesn't it, Bernie? It's a very simple phrase to understand, and it does reflect all that you've shared with us so far. So when the Turkish president makes that statement very, very clear, what is stopping our political leaders from making that statement rather than hiding behind these phrases and, as we're seeing now, trying to hide behind arguments and debates over royal commissions?
Mm-hmm, yeah. Part of the issue is that, again, Muslims can present Islam in a variety of ways, and some would say, well, look, it's perfectly compatible with Western society, with a liberal democracy that we can live under, and we can be contributors to that. And I should say by talking about Islam, I'm not demonising Muslims at all. We actually have 5 living in our house at the moment, refugees that are sharing the house with my wife and I, because they didn't have anywhere else to live. So it's not any kind of personal animosity towards Muslims or dislike for them, but recognising that the ideology that Islam dictates is really quite different. You mentioned that Erdogan, he's talked about Sharia law. Of course, he lives in Turkey where they have elections, which he's been consistently winning, and people challenged him about that. They said, why are you submitting to elections when that's not a part of Sharia law? And his comment was very telling. He said, democracy is a train which we will travel on until we reach our destination. And so for him, the tools and the institutions of Western democracy can be useful ways for him to go to that ultimate goal, as you say, of Sharia law and of an Islamic society.
Now, it seems that I've just heard from a listener that who's just texted in saying that there are 27 Labor-held seats with a significant Muslim population. So from what you're saying there is clearly there's political influence here in Australia, and it surprises me that we're talking Islam now when, if you go right back to the first census in 1911, Islam doesn't get a mention regarding the religions in the country. They were talking about Mohammedism or Mohammedan. So the language has evolved, albeit that Islam was around. It wasn't being used even by, those Arabs or believers themselves back in the day. So the reason why I'm raising this, Josh Frydenberg has called out the need for the teaching of the Holocaust and the Middle East in schools. I nearly died when I heard that. Such a narrow view and such a naive statement to make, particularly from someone that's been in politics for so long. We know that geography is the most important subject to understand history, and history did not begin with the Holocaust. So what do you suggest we learn, given that we have had, since the First Fleet, we have had Jewish convicts, and we have had the introduction particularly of Arabs and so forth as camel trainers or those that could manage camels coming into the country. So this isn't new. So why this harping on the Holocaust, and why this harping on the Middle East alone?
Yeah, okay. And it's important to recognise the history of Muslims in Australia. As you mentioned, they did come in, with the First Fleet, and certainly very early on, and they've been part of society. But we've seen the big changes in the demographics of Muslims in Australia since the 1960s. So the wars in Lebanon, where before that we had Albanians coming in, and the wars in Lebanon, we've seen the number of Muslims increase quite markedly over the last couple of decades, and now they're probably estimate about 1 million Muslims here in Australia. And I think that it's important to recognise that. But the relationship between the Jews and the Muslims has been a troubled one. So right back from the earliest times when Muhammad moved into Medina, there was a significant community of Jews there, and he had initially thought that they would be supportive of him, but in fact they didn't. They opposed him, they mocked him, and eventually he lost patience with them, and he said at one stage in a meeting, "Kill every Jew who falls into your power." And so that set the stage for a program over the next 5 years in Medina. Every Jew in the city had either been exiled or enslaved or executed. So that animosity towards the Jews runs right from the very beginnings of Islam. But then the Jews have had it from other people as well, and the Holocaust was just another example of that. So this was from Hitler and from the National Socialist perspective, where the Jews were seen as the problem, and so there was a turning against them. So we're essentially, sorry to jump in here, Bernie, what we're doing is we're talking about anti-Semitism and the need to understand Jewish history, if you will, from the context of Josh Frydenberg's statement, which is confusing this whole issue around, radical Islam. So it's being conflated. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Yeah. I think the two are connected. So that antipathy towards the Jews is something that's been an element of Islam from the very beginning. And I gave a quote at a public meeting recently about an important Muslim leader in Palestine, saying, "Look, even if the Jews had never come to Israel, we would still be opposed to them. If 1948 had never happened, because they were the enemies of Muhammad 14 centuries ago, they remain as the enemies of Islam, and so that idea has been an element of it." So
do you think that there's a point at which we need to stop talking about the downside of things and start really focusing on the positive side of life and the positive aspects of all of us, such as, for example, Sir John Monash, such a celebrated Australian and such an incredible contribution, particularly to Victoria. Surely those sorts of conversations would make a difference to having that understanding and respect for different communities, rather than always hammering home the right and wrong context.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, particularly you'll see in a liberal democracy where people from all walks of life or backgrounds would be welcome to take part in it, as long as they accept the values that are in it. The idea of freedom of speech, equality of all people, including males and females, and working towards the welfare of all. And people like Sir John Monash have been a great part of that. And again, we've had the same thing with Muslims who have come to Australia, has contributed towards the life. And I think that's really important. We can do that. We can do the multiculturalism thing really quite well. But you'll always find the people who are on the edges, both the extreme left and the extreme right, and I put the Muslims in as another kind of pole within that, are saying, well, we're not happy with the society that's here and we want to change that. And that's where the danger comes from. And the Bondi attack was an example of that. So it's radical Muslims who are saying, we don't want to see the Jews enjoying their situation that they have in Australia, and we'll do what we can to stop that, and hence the attack on the Hanukkah celebration. So I think we need to live in that area where we're saying, look, we can all get on, but recognise that there are some people in the society who don't want to get on. They've got their own agendas, their own ideologies, and they'll do anything that they can to promote those.
You've just made a very profound statement there and used a particular phrase which wraps up our conversation beautifully, Bernie. You said radical Muslims. You didn't say radical Islam. So that brings it back to the individual rather than the entirety. So it seems from what you have said, there's as much confusion within the Muslim world about their place in the world as there is with the 40-odd thousand Christian groups who couldn't decide what they wanted to be or follow. So they've come up with all of these variations, and that's the stuff of life. So, Bernie, thank you so much for being on the show. And I've got to get you back to discuss this in further detail, but the important thing being that Islam is something that we do need to understand, and there is a very firm distinction between Islam and being Muslim. Yes? Thanks, Bernie.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl.
If you've just joined us, we've just had Bernie Power on the show discussing Islam, and it's quite a challenging conversation because we go very deep, and when we have experts on the show, it can go so deep that we've got to keep pulling back to some of this, to the basics. But the important thing is that Islam, and I tend to think that the Turkish President Erdogan, his statement saying that Sharia represents the entirety of Islam's rule on life. It's Sharia law that Islam is wanting to see, and there are Muslims in Australia that are determined to see this Sharia law, and from what Bernie Power says, there are Muslims who aren't quite sure about that. So lots to learn for 2026, which means we have to take what has occurred in 2025 forward so that we can prevent any further tragedies such as Bondi. You're on